A retired schoolteacher was surrounded by men in a hardware store parking lot in broad daylight. 3 of them. The biggest one shoved her against her car door, so hard her grocery bag split on the pavement. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. They just watched through the store window like it was something on television. What they didn't know, what the man doing the shoving couldn't have known, was that her son had just pulled into the lot. He sat behind the wheel of a mud-streaked pickup for exactly 2 seconds. Then he got out, quietly. The dog got out with him. That was the beginning of the end for Harrow Creek. The town sat tucked into the interior of British Columbia, like something that had been forgotten on purpose. 3 hours east of Kamloops, past the point where the highway narrows and the cell signal dies, Harrow Creek occupied a shallow valley between 2 ridgelines that turned purple in October. The Coldwater River ran along its western edge, and the smell of pine resin and wood smoke came through every window from September to May. It was the kind of place that looked like peace from the outside. Agnes Holt had learned over 71 years of living that places like that were often anything but. Agnes had moved back after her husband, Bernard, died of a stroke 4 springs ago. She'd spent 32 years teaching grade 4 in Prince George, and when Bernard was gone, there was nothing left holding her to the city. Harrow Creek was home. She'd grown up here, gone to school here, buried both her parents in the cemetery on the hill above the Lutheran church. It made sense to come back. It made sense until the truck started. The first one appeared in late August, a black F-350 with no plates, parked across from her property on the logging road. It sat there for an hour, then left. She thought nothing of it. Then it came back. Then it brought friends. Her property, 40 acres of mixed forest and river frontage, had been in her family for 3 generations. She'd never once considered selling it. That changed when a man named Gordon Fitch knocked on her door. Gordon was the kind of man who looked trustworthy at first glance. Pressed flannel, clean boots, a handshake that lasted a half-second too long. He worked for a development company out of Kelowna called Ridgeline Capital, and he had an offer for Agnes's land. A generous one, he said. He slid a paper across her kitchen table like it was a gift. She looked at the number. She looked at him. Then she put the paper back in his hand and told him she wasn't interested. Gordon smiled. "You might want to think about it, Mrs. Holt. These opportunities don't come twice." "I know," she said. "Neither does asking politely." He left, but the trucks didn't. Over the following weeks, Agnes noticed things. A section of her fence along the river had been cut, then badly repaired, as if someone had gone through and tried to cover it up. Her neighbor Wendell, an 80-year-old dairy farmer, told her over coffee that Gordon had visited him too. So had the Bouchard family on the north end of the valley. So had old Ray, who owned the feed store. Every one of them had been made the same offer. Every one of them had said no. None of that would have alarmed her so much if it weren't for what happened to Ray. Ray Sundberg had run the Harrow Creek Feed and Hardware for 40 years. He was the kind of man who knew every family in the valley and could tell you where your grandfather had purchased his first set of work gloves. 3 days after turning down Gordon Fitch's offer, Ray found the store's loading dock flooded. Someone had diverted a drainage pipe. A week later, both his supplier accounts were flagged for a code violation nobody could explain. His business license renewal was rejected on procedural grounds that the county had never before applied to anyone. Ray had gone to the RCMP detachment in Merritt. The constable there, a man named Stannard, had listened politely, and Stannard and Gordon Fitch were, according to Wendell, hunting buddies of 15 years. Agnes tried not to think about any of this on the morning of the 3rd Tuesday in October. She had driven into town for groceries and a few odds and ends from Ray's store. She wanted to check on him. She wanted to bring him a jar of the plum preserves she'd put up in September, because Ray's wife had died in July, and he wasn't eating properly. The parking lot behind the hardware store was nearly empty. She had just come back out, grocery bag in one arm, preserves tucked under the other, when the truck pulled in. Not a black F-350 this time. A white one. But the man who got out, heavyset, wearing a vest with the Ridgeline Capital logo on the chest, was someone she recognized. She'd seen him twice on her road, sitting in one of the parked vehicles, watching her house. His name, she'd later learn, was Terrell. He was not alone. 2 others got out with him. Younger. One of them had a smirk built into his face like it was a permanent fixture. Terrell walked toward her without hurry. "Agnes Holt," he said, like it was her fault he knew her name. She didn't answer. She kept moving toward her car. He stepped in front of her. "Gordon thought you might want another chance to look at that number. Before things get complicated, move," she said. He didn't. He put his hand on the roof of her car, blocking her in. The other 2 spread out slightly, one on each side. Casual, unhurried, like they'd done this before. "We've been patient," Terrell said. His voice was low and conversational. Reasonable, almost. That was the worst. "You should take the deal." "My son knows I'm here," Agnes said. Her voice was steady. She'd spent 32 years keeping her voice steady in front of children who needed her to be. Terrell leaned in. "Your son is in Afghanistan." It was at that exact moment, that precise second of cruelty, that the pickup with the BC plates turned off the highway into the lot. The door opened. A man stepped out. Then the rear door opened, and the dog dropped to the ground, already still, already watching. His name was Miles Holt, 37 years old, 14 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, the last 9 attached to Joint Task Force 2. He had returned from his rotation 11 days early due to what his CO had termed a family situation requiring resolution. The CO had not elaborated. Miles had not asked him to. He was not a large man. That was the first thing people always noticed. Or rather, the first thing they noticed they'd been wrong about. Average height. Lean, not bulky. He moved like someone who had been trained to cover ground without making noise, which he had. He wore a gray canvas jacket, worn jeans, and work boots that had actually been worked in. The dog was an 85-pound German Shepherd named Torch. Torch had served alongside Miles for 6 years. He had been retired from active deployment after taking shrapnel to the right shoulder, which had healed cleanly, and he now went where Miles went. He sat when Miles stopped moving. He stood when Miles stood. Right now, Miles was standing still. He had seen everything. He had pulled into the lot slowly, which was his habit. Miles always entered spaces slowly, and he had seen his mother against her car door, the grocery bag on the ground, the 3 men arranged around her. He had assessed the geometry of it in the time it took him to shift into park. He got out. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't run. He walked over. Terrell turned at the sound of footsteps and looked at Miles without particular concern. Then he looked at Torch. The concern came then. Torch was not doing anything threatening. He was simply walking at Miles's left heel, ears forward, and looking at Terrell with the particular quality of attention that trained working dogs have. Complete, unhurried, absolute. Miles stopped 4 feet from Terrell. "Step back," he said. 1 sentence. 2 words. He said it the way a person states something that is already true. Terrell weighed the moment. He was bigger than Miles. He had 2 men with him. He looked again at the dog, then at Miles's eyes. He stepped back. Miles walked past him to his mother. He picked up the grocery bag. He checked her face. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "My hand." He looked at her right hand. The heel of it was scraped where she'd caught herself against the door. He turned around. "Who do you work for?" he asked Terrell. Terrell's smirk had not fully returned. "That's not really your business. Ridgeline Capital," said the young one with the built-in smirk. He seemed to think this was impressive information. Miles took out his phone. He photographed the white truck. He photographed the Ridgeline Capital logo on Terrell's vest. He photographed all 3 men's faces, methodically, the way someone photographs a scene they will need to document later. "You can't just," the smirking one started. Miles had already turned back to his mother. "Get in the truck, Mom." She got in. Torch followed, jumping into the back seat and turning to face the lot. Miles stood at his open driver's door for a moment. He looked at Terrell. "I want you to think carefully about what comes next," he said. "You have one chance to make it simple." He got in. He drove away. In the truck, his mother held her scraped hand in her lap and stared at the dashboard. Outside, the mountains were doing what they do in October, holding the light as long as they could before letting go. "How long has this been going on?" Miles asked. 6 weeks. He nodded slowly. "I should have called sooner," she said. "You called when you called," he said. "That's enough." There are places where the line between civic duty and personal advantage becomes so thin that those in power stop seeing it as a line at all. Harrow Creek had reached that point. The people who understood this earliest were often the ones with the least to lose, which meant they were also the ones with the least power to change it. That evening, Miles sat at his mother's kitchen table, with a notepad and a cup of tea he didn't touch. He had already placed one call, to a contact in Ottawa who worked adjacent to areas Miles was not permitted to name specifically. He had asked that a background check be run on Ridgeline Capital and a man named Gordon Fitch. He had also asked that any federal jurisdiction implications be flagged immediately. Then he drove into town alone. The Harrow Creek Diner had been owned and operated by a woman named Berta Mast for 26 years. Berta was 63, built like someone who had never wasted a movement, and possessed of the particular intelligence of a person who had spent decades watching other people talk. She poured coffee without being asked and said nothing until people were ready. Miles sat at the counter and waited. "You're Agnes's boy," Berta said. "The one in the forces." "Yes." She refilled the cup she'd already poured. "What do you want to know?" "Everything." Berta looked at him for a moment. Then she leaned against the counter and talked for 40 minutes. The picture she drew was thorough and grim. Ridgeline Capital had been circling the valley for 2 years. Their strategy was patient and layered. They made offers. When offers failed, they manufactured complications. Bylaw complaints, permit problems, infrastructure mysteriously breaking down in ways that were expensive to fix. When those things didn't work, men like Terrell arrived. The district councillor for the region was a man named Pierce Holloway. Pierce had been on council for 11 years and was, by general local agreement, the most useless public servant in the history of the valley, distinguished primarily by his ability to look concerned while doing nothing. He had begun, over the past 18 months, making comments at public meetings about the economic benefits of development, about the need for Harrow Creek to grow or die, about the responsibility of landowners to think about the community good. At the same time, Ridgeline Capital had quietly renovated the office building on the main street that Pierce leased for his real estate brokerage, at a rate, according to Wendell's nephew who did the drywalling, of approximately 40% below market. The RCMP detachment commander in Merritt, Stannard, had gone to school with Gordon Fitch. They had been in the same year. This was the kind of fact that everyone in the valley knew and no one said out loud. Miles wrote 2 more names on his notepad: Pierce Holloway, Neil Stannard. "There's one more thing," Berta said. She hesitated for the first time. "Tell me, Ray Sundberg. The hardware store. I know Ray. He went to Stannard 3 times. Each time Stannard told him to come back with documentation. Each time Ray came back with documentation, Stannard said it wasn't sufficient. Last month, Ray's son, he's 22, works at the mill, got arrested for a DUI that he swears didn't happen. He failed a breathalyzer administered by one of Stannard's constables at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday." Berta's voice was flat. Ray sold his property to Ridgeline Capital the following week, for 1/3 of what he'd been offered before he went to the police. The diner was quiet. Through the window, the street was empty, the mountains dark behind the town. Miles put down his pen. "Where does Ray live now?" "His sister's place in Merritt. He couldn't stay." Berta looked at him. "People here are scared, not the dramatic kind of scared, just the kind where you start changing how you do things. You stop complaining. You stop talking in groups. You check over your shoulder. You know what I mean? Yes, Miles said. I know exactly what you mean. He didn't sleep that night, not out of anxiety. That particular kind of agitation had been largely trained out of him, but out of preference. He sat in his mother's living room in the dark with torch at his feet, running through the architecture of what he knew. 3 pillars, Fitch directing operations, Holloway providing political cover, Stannard providing enforcement protection, a triangle, classic structure for a local capture scheme. Remove one pillar and the other 2 could compensate. You needed to bring all 3 down at once, and you needed them to bring each other down by creating circumstances in which each one's survival instinct was turned against the others. You also needed documentation. He waited until 6 a.m. Then he drove to the only address he had for someone who might have it. Her name was Claudette. He'd gotten it from Berta, and she was the administrative assistant who had worked for Pierce Holloway's office for 9 years. She had quit 2 months ago. Berta hadn't known exactly why. She'd mentioned that Claudette now drove 40 minutes to work in Merritt, rather than continue at the Harrow Creek Municipal Office. Miles found her address through the kind of channels he was not going to explain to anyone. She lived in a small house at the edge of town. He knocked at 6:15. A light came on. She came to the door in a housecoat, her gray-streaked hair loose, her face that particular combination of wary and tired that people wear when they've been waiting for something unpleasant. She looked at Miles. She looked at Torch. "You're not from Ridgeline," she said. "No. Then who are you?" Agnes Holt's son. Something shifted in her face. Not relief, it was too early for that, but something adjacent to it. She opened the door. They sat at her kitchen table while the percolator worked on the counter. She wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at the table. "I should have gone to someone sooner," she said. "I kept thinking someone else would. What do you have?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and left the room. She came back with a padded envelope that had been sealed with tape and then sealed again. She set it on the table and didn't let go of it right away. "When I resigned," she said, "I made copies of everything that had passed through that office in the last year. The correspondence. The zoning variance approvals. There were 11 of them, all related to Ridgeline properties, all approved by Pierce within 72 hours. The records of the facility grants that went to the Ridgeline Capitol Office building renovation. Meeting minutes that were altered before they went into the official record." She looked up. "And 3 emails that were sent to Pierce's private account from an address registered to Neil Stannard. They contain the names of landowners who had refused Ridgeline's offers, with notations. 2 of them have asterisks beside their names. One of them is Ray's son." Miles looked at the envelope. "I almost burned it twice," Claudette said. "But you didn't." "No." She finally let go of it, pushed it across the table. "I couldn't." Miles picked it up. He weighed it. It felt like the right amount of damage. "You're going to need somewhere safe to be for the next few days," he said. "My sister in Vernon. Go today. Don't stop to explain to anyone." She nodded. She already had her phone in her hand. By noon, Miles had made 4 calls. The first was to his Ottawa contact again. The second was to a journalist at the Vancouver Sun. A woman he'd met once at a CF event who covered municipal corruption and had the particular fearlessness of someone with nothing to prove. He told her what he had and what it pointed to. She asked 6 questions. He answered all 6. She said she'd drive up. The third call was to the BC RCMP Professional Standards Unit, not to Stannard's detachment in Merritt, but directly to the oversight body in Vancouver. He spoke for 18 minutes and provided the digital copies Claudette had given him authorization to share. The fourth call was to Berta. "Tell people," he said. "Tell them what?" "Tell them something is happening. That's enough for now." There was a pause. "How long have you been home?" Berta asked. 31 hours. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Your mother always said you were efficient." Gordon Fitch was in his car on the logging road above Agnes's property when his phone rang. He had driven up that morning out of habit. Checking his assets, he liked to think of it. He answered without looking at the number. "Mr. Fitch," said a voice he didn't recognize. Calm. Flat. "You should know that the documents from Pierce Holloway's office are now with professional standards in Vancouver. The standard correspondence is included. I'd estimate you have a few hours before this becomes considerably less manageable." Gordon opened his mouth. Nothing came. "This is the one chance to make it simple," the voice said. "I'd suggest you think about whether cooperation is in your interest." The line went dead. Gordon sat very still. He looked out at the valley, the river, the farms, the clean lines of property he'd spent 2 years trying to reshape into something he could monetize. Then he dialed Pierce Holloway. Pierce didn't answer. He was at that moment watching a news van with Vancouver plates pull slowly down the main street of Harrow Creek. The next 48 hours moved the way these things do when they finally start moving, slowly at first, then suddenly all at once. The Vancouver Sun ran the initial story online that same afternoon, based on documents independently reviewed by their legal team. The headline was restrained by tabloid standards, but precise. "Documents link BC councillor, developer in alleged land pressure campaign." It named Pierce Holloway. It named Gordon Fitch and Ridgeline Capital. It named Neil Stannard by title, without, at that stage, direct accusation. The documents spoke for themselves. Professional standards suspended Stannard pending investigation by the end of the first day. 2 of his constables, the ones most frequently deployed on calls involving Ridgeline-adjacent property owners, were placed on administrative leave. Ray Sundberg's son's DUI record was flagged for review. On the second morning, Gordon Fitch retained a lawyer. By afternoon, the lawyer had recommended cooperation with investigators. Gordon, who was many things but not a man who absorbed consequences he could redirect, provided a statement that named names and traced the full operational history of the scheme back to its inception 18 months prior. Pierce Holloway, watching his world narrow to a point, attempted to leave Harrow Creek on the second night. He made it as far as the highway before realizing that leaving quietly was the kind of thing that looked, in retrospect, exactly like what it was. He turned around and drove back. He was met at the municipal office the following morning by a member of the Provincial Integrity Commissioner's office, 2 RCMP investigators from Vancouver, and Berta Mast, who had shown up with coffee and the particular expression of a person who had waited a long time for a Tuesday morning. The thing about Harrow Creek, the thing that Ridgeline Capital had understood and tried to exploit, was that small towns are not simply collections of property. They are collections of memory. The river frontage that Ridgeline had wanted from Agnes Holt was not just 40 acres. It was 3 generations. It was where her father had taught her to fish. It was where she had brought her students for a creek study every May for 20 years. It was where, on a Saturday afternoon 4 springs ago, she had sat alone after Bernard's funeral and let herself cry properly for the first time. You cannot put a number on that. Gordon Fitch had tried. He'd been wrong. Harrow Creek, in the weeks that followed, went through the particular collective recovery of a community that has discovered its own resilience by being tested. The new council appointed an interim administrator from outside the valley, a sharp, unsentimental woman who went through the zoning records with the focused attention of someone who had done this kind of cleanup before. The 11 variance approvals were reviewed. 8 were reversed. The Ridgeline Capital properties acquired through the pressure campaign were flagged by the Provincial Land Registry, and the families whose names appeared in Claudette's documents were notified of their legal options. Ray Sundberg drove back to Harrow Creek from his sister's place in Merritt on a Thursday in November, 6 weeks after Miles had arrived. He stood in front of his hardware store, still his, still standing, and put his hand on the doorframe for a long moment. Then he went inside and turned the lights on. Berta organized a community meeting not to relitigate what had happened, but to talk about what came next. 43 people showed up. Agnes was there, her scraped hand long since healed, sitting in the front row with the straightened spine of someone who had endured the worst of it, and came out knowing exactly who she was. Miles sat in the back. Torch lay under his chair. At the end of the evening, Wendell, 80 years old, speaking from the floor with the careful slowness of a man who picks his words like he once picked stones from a field, said that he wanted to thank Agnes's son, not for being some kind of hero, just for being the kind of person who comes home when it matters and knows what to do when he gets there. There was a round of applause. Miles nodded once from the back of the room. He didn't stand. He had planned to leave on the Saturday. 2 more days of leave before he had to report back. He sat on the porch on Friday evening while his mother made dinner inside, and Torch lay in the yard, watching a squirrel make poor decisions in the cedar tree. The valley was going dark in the way it only does in the interior of BC in November, not dramatically, just a slow recession of light, the ridgelines holding their shapes longer than seems possible before dissolving into the sky. Agnes came out with 2 cups of tea and sat down beside him. They were quiet for a while. "I could sell, you know," she said, "someday, on my own terms, if I wanted to." "I know, but I don't want to. I know that too." She looked at her land, the trees, the dark line where the river ran. "Your father loved this place. He did. He would have been terrible at what you did this week," she said. Too loud. Miles almost smiled. He was better at other things. Agnes wrapped both hands around her mug. The squirrel had won whatever argument it was having with Torch. Torch had decided not to escalate. He looked up at Miles once, as if checking in, then put his head back down. "Will you come back at Christmas?" Agnes asked. "If they let me. I'll make the plum cake." "That's a good reason," he said. The stars were coming out. The kind of stars you only get that far from a city, dense and close, the kind that make the sky look crowded with something. Miles sat with his mother in the quiet and let the week go. Not forgotten, not gone. Just set down the way you set down something heavy when you've carried it far enough. Torch stretched once and sighed. The narrator has no tidy lesson to offer here. The valley had been threatened, and the valley had held. A woman who had stood her ground for 40 acres of memory had discovered she was not standing alone, and a man who had spent 14 years learning how to face the worst of what people do to each other had come home, for a little while, to the place where he first learned why it was worth it. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is everything.